Hey everybody. I'm going to let people continue to come in, sit down. My name is Kevin McIntosh, and I get to serve as a coordinator for our Campus Interfaith Resources Office here at Grand Valley. I want to thank just a couple of people. I want to thank the Kaufman Interfaith Institute, Campus Ministry, our Muslim Student Association, and then also Calvin University for helping co-sponsor this event. In the back, if you don't have a green sheet of paper on your laps right now, if somebody wants to hold it up so people know what the green sheet of paper looks like. Yeah, it looks great. If you don't have one of those, please go to the back and grab one. That is our evals. That helps us know what works and what doesn't work for this lecture. We also, and it depends on each person, we have post-it notes in the back. If you have a question during the lecture, at the end, if you don't want to ask it, or if you want to write it down someplace else, you can write it on a post-it note, and me and a few other people will be going around the end, and we can collect those and ask it for you. I'm really excited to welcome Tess to introduce Kevin. Tess is a member of Campus Ministry. She's on the leadership team there, and she's going to introduce our keynote speaker. Thank you all.
Hi. So Kevin was born and raised at the intersection of his mother's evangelical faith and his father's Reformed Jewish roots. He holds degrees in media and theology from North Illinois University, Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and Wheaton College. He is also the co-founder and co-director of the Neighborly Roots podcast. Here's Kevin.
How's everybody doing tonight? Can you hear me okay? All right. Well, thank you so much for coming. So great to be here at Grand Valley State, and I spent some of the day today too at Calvin University, which is a fantastic campus. Even the person I sat next to on the plane was nice, and how often does that happen? She was giving me a list of all the different restaurants I need to check out here, like a tapas place in downtown Grand Rapids. Does that sound familiar? That's right. Yes, I heard it over here. So I'm gonna have to check that out while I'm here. And maybe a brewery? Not me, though. I don't. So I'll start like this. Really, the reason I'm standing here today is because a man who was raised Jewish, who eventually renounced religion altogether, but who actually attended church the last few years of his life, told me I would maybe go on to do great things. And that man was my father. In my house growing up, it was a well-known and well-understood fact that my dad did not want to talk about religion. When he was a kid, he faced insults and bullying for being part of a Jewish family, and that's all religion ever really meant for him. On the subject, we would press and press and press, and he would always say, I just don't like talking about that stuff. Now, fast forward 5 years into my parents' marriage, my mom becomes an evangelical Christian. And I'm taking my kids to church, I don't care what you say, evangelical Christian. And I'm buying my kids storybook Bibles with vivid depictions of biblical violence, evangelical Christians. You can imagine the scene when my father walked into my bedroom when I was 6 years old, where I was gazing at a picture of Jesus, bloody and in agony, being executed publicly on a cross. Let's just say he wasn't happy, to say the least. So in my house, we didn't pray together. We didn't leave Bibles sitting on end tables with cute little bookmarks in them. We didn't have parties celebrating our baptisms or our first communion. We didn't have Christian symbols on the walls. We didn't have Christian music playing softly in the background like at a Chick-fil-A. I do appreciate that, though. For all intents and purposes, if you spent a Sunday afternoon at my house, you would never know by the sheer looks of it that my mother and my brothers and I were committed church-going Christians. However, you might wonder if we were Jewish. About once a month, my father's Jewish family came over to our house, or we would go to one of theirs. Together, we ate a lot of kugel. Has anyone ever eaten kugel here? Okay. I was really afraid everyone was going to look at me like I was crazy. It's like a sweet noodle dish. Sometimes it has raisins in it. I always thought it tasted really strange, I'll be honest. But Jewish families are very tight-knit, so we all ate the kugel. Now, over the years, I saw my cousins preparing for their bar mitzvahs, their bat mitzvahs. I heard all about their birthright trips to Israel. On a few occasions, the whole family celebrated Passover together, and I've attended a bunch of Jewish weddings. I've been the person, right, holding the chair up in the air. In fact, I've got another one in August that I'm going to. And every once in a blue moon, they would ask me about Christianity. They would ask me about Jesus. And the reason I'm telling this story is I think it's really critical to understand, like these posters say, like, evangelical interfaith advocates, or what does that mean? What does that look like? I think for me, it really began in that I really learned how to be Christian in these environments. I didn't grow up in a God-fearing, Bible-believing Christian home like a lot of my evangelical brethren did here in America. I had to be careful and cautious about if, when, and how I expressed my Christian worldview to my father and his family. I didn't have the luxury of being bold about my faith out there in the big wide world before retreating back into a warm Christian environment and leaving the results to God. My mom and my brothers and I, we wanted nothing more than for my dad and his family to know Jesus like we knew Jesus. And so there were serious stakes involved. So when it comes to being a devout or a Christian, a deep Christian, in a world full of different religious beliefs, I really don't know how to be Christian any other way. It's really how I was raised. You see, I didn't realize how normal, or rather abnormal, this was until I started teaching world religions courses at a community college back in 2012. I was coming out of 5 years of starting new churches with the Southern Baptist Convention, where I became an expert snake handler. I'm kidding. But my wife, Brittany, and I were due with our first. We have 4 kids. So at this point in time in our lives, with 4 kids under 7, we're not thriving, we are surviving, if you know what I mean. But anyway, I really needed the extra income. And so originally I had hoped that the community college might hire me to teach New Testament or Old Testament. After all, my master's degree was in Christian theology. But nope, they asked me to teach world religions, which at the time I knew very little about. But as it turns out, I loved teaching it. I mean, I was literally getting paid to have spiritual conversations with students. Every evangelical's dream. They were asking me about Christianity. What made this so exhilarating was that many of my students didn't have a Christian background. So there I was, trying to explain the Trinity to a Muslim, or the resurrection of Christ to a Buddhist, or why the Bible has 2 testaments to a Hindu, whose texts could fill several American libraries. They were asking me questions I had never thought of before, and in hunting down the answers to those questions, I actually grew in my knowledge of the Christian faith. You heard it right. Hanging out with Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists caused me to grow in my own Christian faith. As you can imagine, I was so excited to take these stories back to my evangelical brothers and sisters, but they looked at me like I was born and raised in Area 51, which I was. That did not go down as I thought. That's okay. But really, I would either get that spiritual power pat, like, oh, that's so nice, you keep right on serving the Lord. Or people would immediately start spewing whatever misinformation or biases they had about Muslims just to get it off their chest. I quickly learned that there is basically no vocabulary or track record in the evangelical community for engaging with other faiths in any constructive way, and even less reflection on how we could be good neighbors to them as Christ commanded us to do. This total lack of experience engaging constructively with other faiths made even the most humble and sincere evangelicals I knew susceptible to three things. One, believing false media tropes about Muslims. B, reducing all Christian faiths to one category, demonology. And three, assessing interfaith friendships purely in terms of risk rather than reward. The crazy thing is, in the evangelical communities that I've been a part of, people are really serious about loving others into the Christian faith. The evangelicals I know, they will literally go across the world, literally to the most remote parts of the world to tell somebody, anybody, about Jesus. But I'll tell you what, they would not walk across the street and have dinner with a Muslim or a Hindu. You want to talk about demonology? Demonology is that voice in the American evangelical church telling us to fear our neighbors and stay away from them. Avoiding our neighbors and spreading lies about our neighbors, that is what is anti-Christian. That is anti-gospel. Instead of being a light on a hill, we're the bullies on the playground of religious diversity in America. And the worst part is, no one really seemed to notice that this was totally out of step with our desire to show others the love of Christ. So I knew something had to be done. But before I go any further, I want to make it clear that I love the evangelical community. I'm not one of those people who's going to devote my life throwing rocks at the evangelical church from the outside. When I fell out of a really bad relationship in college and had no friends and nowhere to go, the evangelical community welcomed me in. When my dad passed away on vacation of a heart attack back in 2013, the evangelical community was there for me, cried with me, prayed for me. They all showed up for the funeral and stayed late. I believe in my heart that the evangelical community has the capacity to be the most hospitable, loving, and generous people in our society, which is crazy, right? But here's the thing. Throughout the course of all of our lives, every one of us is going to face disappointment and resistance in our own religious communities. In these situations, you really have two choices. You can either back out of your community or lean in and try to make things better, and I chose to lean in. So when I was pursuing a second master's degree at Wheaton College back in 2015, my colleague Chris and I started Neighborly Faith. It was around that time that one professor at the college by the name of Dr. Larisha Hawkins posted a picture on Facebook wearing a hijab with the words, "Christians and Muslims worship the same God." There was, as many of you may know, massive public fallout, protests, donors on both sides of the debate pulling their funding. It was really ugly. And eventually the college and Dr. Hawkins mutually agreed to part ways. As a student in the theology department, I expected that there would be opportunities to talk in class about what Dr. Hawkins said and what Dr. Hawkins did. But that didn't happen. One of my professors just barely grazed the issue and then moved on. For a class project, we were put in groups and asked to launch a media campaign to raise awareness about the Syrian refugee crisis in some way. I remember telling my group of students, well, many of these refugees are Muslims. If our churches aren't down with Muslims, how are we going to address that? Crickets. There was just no category for that. At the same time, I saw images of evangelicals lining up outside of their neighborhood Chick-fil-A's to support the company's stance against gay marriage, protesting mosques, arguing in the courts that Islam isn't even a religion, but a political system bent on takeover. I thought, we just look like jerks. Clearly more interested in rallying around our values and our fears than taking one moment to think about how this looks to our neighbors. See, these early experiences were really pivotal. If you want to know how two master's students find the time to start an organization and write 30-page papers and apply for PhD programs, that's how. My mom, she sent me a letter. I'll never forget this. I still have it on my desk. She said, "I'm afraid of what Christians are going to say about you." I had a good friend, a pastor, stand just 2 feet away from me in my garage and tell me how much of a bad idea neighborly faith was. I even got a message from the executive director of an interfaith organization. He said this, quote, "I will be frank and upfront. I wouldn't put energy into this and didn't offer encouragement to you precisely because I feel that you are bailing water when there is a hole in the ship." Look, I'm a middle child. If someone tells me something's a bad idea, I want to do it even more. Any middle children in the room? Okay, then you know what I'm talking about. For a year, Neighborly Faith just had a really cool website, which is technically 95% of the work in the nonprofit sector. We had a picture of a steeple, a picture of 2 people shaking hands. Done. Put it on the resume. Then we started surveying the interfaith world. Went to a few interfaith conferences. We figured out fairly quickly that most interfaith spaces in this country aren't built for religious conservatives. And most of the time, they don't even realize it. On more than one occasion, I've heard people in these spaces say that evangelicals aren't welcome or anyone with exclusive truth claims. But then, they're up there on the stage saying that everybody comes from the same divine spirit and anyone who says otherwise is dead wrong. So, is that an exclusive truth claim? We knew we had to build something that evangelicals could buy into, something homegrown. So we started looking for evangelical conservatives doing this work. It turns out there's a bunch of them. So we started a podcast to lift up their stories. We knew the only way we could get evangelicals to buy in is if we made positive engagement with other faiths appear normal and totally faithful to Christ. A lot of people don't realize that devout evangelicals are rarely enticed by civic arguments for interfaith engagement. Phrases like finding common ground or peace building or improving our communities rarely resonate with the evangelical audience. Typically, evangelicals have one thing on the brain. Is this faithful to Christ? Does this square with the person and the teachings of Jesus Christ in the Bible? Did I remain true and loyal to Jesus when I did this thing, this event? If there's any doubt, it's off. It's not going to happen. We started getting messages from people listening to the podcast. One guy, a student from a conservative evangelical seminary, said this, quote, "I was recently invited to celebrate Passover at a local synagogue and I had no intention on going. But after listening to the podcast, I now know that I can enter into that space and remain totally true to my beliefs and even make friends while I'm there." We also started seeing more and more data come out saying that young evangelicals have more positive attitudes toward Muslims than previous generations. We started to ask ourselves, what would it look like if we empowered young evangelicals to build pathways on campus and at church for Muslim engagement? What if instead of trying to address Islamophobia from the top down, working with older adults, we leveraged the positive attitudes of young evangelicals to change their institutions from the bottom up? We started looking for funding to start a fellows program that would provide coaching for young evangelicals on how to do this, along with some seed funding that would allow them to launch a brand new program on their campus or at their church. It turns out Muslims loved the idea and started throwing money at it left and right. They were seeing a lot of the same trends that we were. And the first year of the program has been phenomenal. This fall, our 10 fellows will be launching programs on Christian and non-Christian campuses across America that will bring evangelicals and Muslims together. A few of our fellows are also creating opportunities for their conservative churches to visit mosques or to welcome Muslims into their church for the very first time. One of our fellows is a junior at Taylor University in Indiana. She wrote for the Christian Post and Sojourners about her experience bringing her church to a mosque for the first time. This is what she wrote. "We must remember that people of other faiths are image bearers of God. And because God hasn't left himself without a witness in the world, Romans 1:20, they are equipped and capable of showing loving kindness." And here's the profound and provocative challenge today, she writes. "Because Jesus is present in their stories, it's about time the church got to know these stories and learned how to be part of them as well." After the visit, we discussed what we found surprising, she writes, talking about the members of her church. as well as what is similar and distinct about our religions. This is my favorite part. She writes, "We considered experiences of Islamophobia, the Muslim ban, and media representation. Some in the group were able to reflect on these topics with real people and stories in their minds for the first time." One church member said it well: if a Muslim, like the tour guide at the mosque, were to move into his neighborhood, he would be more than happy to call her neighbor and friend. Through listening, learning, experiencing, and empathizing, this congregant has humanized a religion that makes up 24% of the world's religious landscape and is one of the most direly misunderstood. He has grown in his propensity to engage in civil discourse and friendship with the very people he had previously perceived as the other. Pew Research, which is a large research firm out of Washington, D.C. that studies religious trends in America, has shown on numerous occasions that if you have just one friend of another faith, even just one conversation, you're significantly more likely to respect that faith. And the thing is, evangelicals are no exception to that rule. It doesn't matter the age, how they vote, nothing. Die-hard political conservatives aren't even an exception to that rule. My brother Nathan is a very, 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 very politically conservative person. He's libertarian, in fact. He hates liberals like no one has ever hated liberals. He doesn't have any close liberal friends. But he likes Muslims. Why? Well, his landlord and his family are Muslims. And they're wonderful people. When things break, the landlord fixes them immediately. They came over for dinner once, and Nathan told me about their conversation. He said the entire conversation was about how he loves us, how we love him and his family. We love the arrangement. Everybody's blessed. And then at the end of the conversation, the landlord says, kind of awkwardly, "Taxes are increasing, and I'm wondering if you are interested in paying $50 more a month in rent for that reason." He was then apologetic, these are Nathan's words, and he said, "I'm sure I'm not doing this right." But when Becky, his wife, and I talked, we both agreed that $50 per month to keep him and his family in good hands financially and to keep the relationship pure was more than worth the extra cost. This was interesting how he ended this. He said, "But here's the thing. I don't care that he's Muslim. He's a good dude. He has integrity, and we would sacrifice for him and his family gladly because they are amazing." Pretty awesome, right? Anyway, this year, we're also, Neighborly Faith is also going to be at a few evangelical colleges to host conversations just like this and bring in some of those evangelical leaders we've had on our podcast and hopefully get some things started there as well. That's going to be at Wheaton College on November 1st and 2nd if you're interested in this topic, sort of how we can engage more conversations in the evangelical community about this. Well, I suppose I should probably get around to telling you some of the practicalities you should take away from this talk. So there's, I think, at least three. The first is this. Don't give up on evangelicals. Don't give up on evangelicals. I think there's a temptation in this political moment, particularly in interfaith spaces, to lump all evangelicals together in one basket called Trumpers or bigots. Put a bow on it and then toss the whole basket out. It doesn't matter their age, their race, their ethnicity, their gender, or socioeconomic status. Every evangelical is a threat to democracy and inclusion, and that's it. This does everyone a disservice, and particularly young evangelicals who are more open to interfaith work than most people actually realize. If you think about it, at some point in time, someone offered me a seat at the interfaith table. If that never happened, I wouldn't be here encouraging other evangelicals to get involved in interfaith work. This past August, I was invited to speak at the Interfaith Youth Corps' Interfaith Leadership Institute in Chicago. For one session, they organized the main hall into large round tables, broken down by worldview identity, so Muslim, Hindu, mainline Protestant, Christian, Catholic, evangelical, etc. And the evangelical table was totally packed. There wasn't one open seat. These students were so eager to write a new story about evangelicals and interfaith work on their campuses. One recent study found that only 25% of young white evangelicals are very favorable of Trump, compared to 55% of older evangelicals. But most people wouldn't know that because in the media, evangelicals are always baby boomers or older, white and proud of it, and highly politically engaged far-right conservatives. And evangelical leaders are always Franklin Graham, Jerry Falwell Jr., Paula White, and Robert Jeffress, none of which have any following among young people. Look, I've been hanging out with evangelical students for the past year, who don't fit any of these categories, and neither do their friends. If it's true that evangelicals make up nearly 30% of our country, including hundreds of thousands of students involved in evangelical campus groups, interfaith initiatives cannot afford to ignore or despise this group if they want to heal serious divisions in our society. To bring about the world we want, I like to say, evangelicals are going to have to contribute positively in some way. The question is, are interfaith leaders committed to figuring out how they can contribute? At this point, I specifically wrote this down. I really want to give a shout out to Kevin McIntosh, who's back there, to just say he's done a tremendous job here at Grand Valley State, and particularly in this area. He's the one who reached out to me and asked me to come, and I couldn't be more grateful for the opportunity. So I just want to say you've been an incredible host. Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, it's been really fun. He's also got a great bow tie on. He's a Devil Rays fan, so he's missing a big game tonight. The second takeaway is this. Young evangelicals are going to write a new story about the church's engagement with people of other faiths, and they are in college right now. Did you know that this is the very first year that an incoming freshman class were not alive when the events of 9/11 happened? Have you ever thought about that? Sadly, many evangelicals struggle with Islam because of their historical memory about 9/11. We actually took our fellows to New York City this past April for our retreat, and we visited the Ground Zero monuments. I remember looking down over one of the fountains and thinking, for many evangelicals in their 40s and above, this massive hole in the ground represents a massive wall between them and their Muslim neighbors. But for incoming freshmen, they will never live with that historical memory, at least not in the same way. I think that's going to make a significant difference in the long run. Also, as I mentioned before, young evangelicals continue to show rapid growth in their respect toward Muslims. The Public Religion Research Initiative polled evangelicals in 2011 on their feelings toward Muslims, so about 8 years ago, and what they found was pretty incredible. 62% of younger white evangelicals feel comfortable when a Muslim woman is wearing the burqa in public, compared to only 38% of older white evangelicals. 51% of younger white evangelicals feel comfortable with a group of Muslim men kneeling to pray in an airport, compared to only 40% of older white evangelicals. Finally, more than 6 in 10, so 63% of younger white evangelicals say that they would be comfortable with a Muslim teaching elementary school in their community, compared to only 1/3, or 33% of older white evangelicals. And I share these statistics not because these statistics are perfect or because it's exactly where we want to go. But imagine if in the next 2 decades, appreciation for Muslims doubles in the evangelical community because of the more positive attitudes brought in by the next generation of evangelical leaders. The data suggests that things are heading quickly in that direction, and there's a lot of reason to hope. But finally, because every good evangelical sermon has 3 points, when it comes to building bridges of friendship with evangelicals, or evangelicals building bridges of friendship with other faiths, there really needs to be greater acknowledgement that someone can be both theologically conservative and a terrific neighbor. A few weeks ago, I found out that another ministry in my city, devoted to bringing Christians and Muslims together, deeply offended one of the local mosques. Essentially, they organized a dinner with the intention of sharing the message of Jesus with local Muslim families without showing them proper care. They didn't prepare or even allow a space for the Muslim attendees to pray. They spoke for over 40 minutes without affording a Muslim leader the same opportunity to speak. They came off as really aggressive at times, and they didn't even bother to consult with the mosque leadership before the event. They literally went through the phone book and sent flyers to addresses attached to names that seemed Muslim. I told this story to a group of 200 students at Wheaton College a few weeks ago, and then I asked them this question. I said, what if the two guys who organized that event said, I'm sorry to hear that the mosque was offended, but the gospel of Jesus Christ will offend people. We aim to please Christ, not man. How would you reply? I'll never forget when one student in the very back row stood up on top of his chair and shouted out, it sounds to me like it wasn't the gospel that was offensive, it was the organizers of the event that were offensive. And the entire room burst into applause. The guys who organized this event didn't mistreat their Muslim neighbors because they're conservative. Being careless and insensitive isn't inherent to theological conservatism, any more than being greedy, selfish, or dishonest. No, what we're really talking about here is what I call public witness, or in more simple terms, a consideration or lack thereof of how our actions are going to be perceived by others in the public square. And the mistake of failing to consider how our actions will be received is not limited to one religious or non-religious orientation. In the evangelical community, there's a temptation to think that when it comes to getting out there and telling the world about Jesus, that somehow the only thing that matters is that people hear. Our reputation doesn't matter, building trust doesn't matter, authentic friendships don't really matter, listening to people we don't agree with for more than 10 seconds doesn't matter. I think deep inside, many evangelicals, and I've been guilty of this too, think that Jesus is going to magically redeem all of those bad social habits as long as we're faithful to get the word out. But that's not what Jesus said. Jesus told his followers in Matthew chapter 5, you are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works, and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. The Apostle Paul was also deeply concerned with how he and his ministry would be received. He told the church in Corinth, for though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew, in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, that I might win those outside the law. He said, to the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I might share with them in its blessings. See, it's not just what we say, but who we are in the public square that matters. The kind of neighbors we are matters. Jesus understood that. Paul understood that. Some evangelicals understand that, but a lot of evangelicals don't. But what the world needs is a lot more evangelicals who do. And that's what we're trying really hard to do with Neighborly Faith. To close, I'll tell you a little bit about Cody, one of our fellows this year. Cody grew up in a Christian homeschool and now attends a conservative Southern Baptist seminary. When Cody interviewed for the fellowship, let's just say we had our doubts. So we actually didn't accept him. But when one of our fellows had to drop out last minute, we decided to give him a chance. Let me read to you something that Cody wrote recently in an op-ed. He wrote this. When I first learned about principled pluralism, I immediately became defensive. I assumed it was nothing more than moral relativism. But I learned that principled pluralism addresses some of the most difficult questions that face our nation by advocating for human beings on the basis of the image of God and love of neighbor. He writes, the image of God compels me to listen to and understand someone's worldview without devaluing their personhood, not because all truth claims are equal, but because all people are. If I neglect the basic dignity of a person based on their religious convictions, then I have violated the created order that God has ordained. People embody the ideals of principled pluralism when they treat their fellow humans with respect and dignity, listening to and learning from the viewpoint of the other, whether they are Democrat, Republican, Muslim, or Jew. What's great is that Cody learned that he could be a theologically conservative evangelical Christian and embrace principled pluralism as a legitimate social framework in which he could be a terrific neighbor. This is what we're hoping to communicate to evangelicals on college campuses and in churches across America, that loving Jesus with reckless abandon and loving our neighbors with the same zeal is not an either or. It can and should be a both and. This is what eventually compelled my father to start attending church just a few years before he died. He found a church that was serious about loving their neighbors, and they just happened to have a team that provided repairs in the homes of the elderly and others in need, and he loved swinging a hammer and fixing things, so that was right up his alley. I see my father's face and my father's story in every person of another faith that I meet. I realize that they're not going to trust me or respect my faith accidentally. In the words of Jesus, I must let my light shine before them, that they might see my good works and give glory to my Father in heaven. Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking time out. I know of your PhD program and Neighborly Faith and everything else to be here for this. We have some time for some questions. Some people might have grabbed Post-it notes. If you are like me and don't always like to raise your hand in a space like this, you're welcome to write down a question on a Post-it note, and myself, I'm going to volunteer her, and Maddie will come around and collect those. If you have it, just raise it up and one of us can come grab it. If you have a question and you are okay, just ask it on the microphone. I can also hand you a mic if you'll have questions. Yeah. I'll start with my first question.
All right.
I always have questions.
Yeah.
So you talked about this a little bit, but how do you deal with some of this pushback, right? How do you deal with being sometimes it feels like, it looks like might be true, this lone wolf? Like how do you, I don't like that term, lone wolf, I want to change that. The one person doing this interfaith work or building, as you say, just building friendships with people inside your community when the media gives a different narrative sometimes.
Yeah, that's a great question. So one thing that I try to do as much as possible is I try to take the niche out of interfaith work. So let me give you an example. Most people in my conservative Baptist church had never met a Muslim. And I really wanted to introduce them to local Muslim families. And of course, the question automatically becomes like, how am I gonna introduce this? I mean, how am I gonna sell this, right? And I think there's lots of models out there that might say, well, frame it as a dialogue, frame it as maybe a bridge building activity. And what I found gained the most traction with my church is just keeping it simple and calling it what it is, which is, do you know how last week we packed school bags for kids who can't afford school supplies? This week we're gonna hang out and we're gonna serve our Muslim neighbors. Like, it's trying to connect it to the values of our church to be serving those around us in our community. In other words, I tried really hard not to pump it up like it was this big event that we all needed to do training for. I just said, like, be yourself. And miraculously, it was great. And we spent an absolutely absurd amount of money at the best halal restaurant in town. for them, and they walked in and they were just astonished that our church would be so generous. And that's another way I've really tried to couch this work in a way that my community can resonate with, is that really what we're doing is we're just providing a really impressive amount of generosity to these communities. And I've been able to gain a lot of traction that way by just keeping it simple, speaking to values like being a good neighbor, values like being a light on a hill, and just thinking and talking as much as I can about the person of Christ and how he treated people. In other words, I try to connect it as much as possible to the vision and values of my church, and that was really helpful. It ended up working out really well, and the feedback was incredible. So I think there are a lot of people who go into interfaith work, and they do go lone wolf. Maybe they don't have as strong of connections with their place of worship anymore, and that's regrettable. I think for me to be able to do this work in any intelligible way, I have to love the church. I have to attend the church. I have to be integrated in the church. My wife and I, my 4 kids, go to that church. They have a children's ministry because of our family, I think. And so for all of those reasons, I try to make it as much as I can something that we as the church do, not something that I alone am doing. And again, afterwards, I don't pump it up like, oh, we're all interfaith leaders now. I say, how did that feel? Like, how did that feel to do that? What did you learn? Like, what did you walk away? One of the girls in my Bible study, she said, my mom, my sister, my cousin, they all told me not to come. They said, this is not faithful. This is not faithful to Christ. And she said, I came, and it was a phenomenal experience. She said, I have this weird feeling where I'm actually really admire the outreach director from the mosque. I said, that's okay. Like, you can admire a human being, even if they aren't a Christian. And I know that sounds really petty and obvious, but there are people who literally have to create space in their theological framework to just admire someone of another faith tradition that's not Christianity. And so again, it's just trying to keep it simple and trying to tell my church as much as possible, like, let's just be who we are, so that it doesn't become this project that I alone am working on. Yeah.
Hi. Going once for questions. Not. Thank you so much. We got
There's a hand.
got a hand in the back. Oh, my boss.
Hi.
Hi.
So so I'm appreciating that you talked about how people in every religion can just be lousy people, right?
Right.
They show up and
Yeah.
make gaffes, and this idea though that for people who feel oppressed or marginalized, that often that attention, that weight feels like it can come from the evangelical community.
Yep.
Can you talk about if you ever talk in your community about power and privilege and who has a voice, why the weight of that may feel heavier? Because I worry that without that, we're just talking about sort of behavior without talking about the systems that religion is situated within.
Yeah, I mean, it's no secret that the evangelical church has been exposed in many ways since 2016. And any evangelical who's honest will say that. That the notoriety of our faith community is seriously been compromised. People don't see us as neighbors they can count on and they can trust to serve their welfare, even if they don't believe the same things we do. A lot of people see evangelicals as people who are fighting for their own freedoms, for their own place in society, and we don't really care much for the interests of others, which is really sad. I mean, I told that story about the Chick-fil-A, like seeing people line up outside of Chick-fil-A's. That's serving our interests. That's not serving the interests of others. And so, which is really hard. I think if I were to stand in front of my evangelical church right now, I could not start that conversation foregrounding words like power and privilege, right? There's translation work. When you work with communities that are maybe a little bit further behind, I think there's translation work. A lot of it, really, what I do is I bring it back to who do we say that we are and who is the God that we serve, and are our actions in line with that or not? It's unlikely you'll find someone who would say, yes, I'm perfectly living out and animating the values and who Christ was. It's very difficult to find a person like that. The question, of course, is, and I think the lawyer asked Jesus this in the parable of the Good Samaritan, like, who is my neighbor? And one of the things I am constantly pressing evangelical churches to think about is, do you know your neighbor? And if not, how will your neighbors ever get to know you? And when I take that interpersonal standpoint, when I take that interpersonal approach, and when those relationships start to be formed and be nurtured, then that opens up a little bit more bandwidth to talk more about what are ways that we are contributing to the marginalization of our neighbors. But it really has to start with saying, I know a neighbor that I can be compassionate toward. I know a neighbor whose story I have heard. And that's why for Neighborly Faith, the number one thing we're concerned about is proximity. Like, are we actually getting evangelicals in the room with Muslims or people of other faiths or not? If we're not, it's so much easier to think about Muslims as theoretical Muslims or theoretical liberals, right? Or theoretical conservatives. And as long as we do that, conversations about power and privilege will only be received negatively. And so that's why for us, a win is to say, like, I think Carissa said it really well in her piece, like, they thought about power and privilege with regards to Islamophobia for the first time because they had a real person in their mind that they were thinking about. And so I guess proximity is just so much of a priority for us. We've got a lot of work to do just in that regard. But if you've read anything I've ever written, I talk a lot about Christian privilege, and particularly the Christian persecution complex, which is basically this understanding that Christianity is always under attack, and the only faithful thing we can ever do in this country is defend ourselves, and how much that has totally sucked the life out of the church's love and compassion for its neighbors, because we're always feeling like we're under attack, so we need to defend. I personally find that to be the most troubling thing that I've been working pretty hard consistently to address. And even had a conversation recently at a Bible study where it was a doorway to say, look at the person of Christ who was persecuted for our sake. What was his response to persecution? It was continue to live for the interests of others. And so continue to bring it back to Christ and who he was is a big part of what we do.
I want to look at the other side of power and privilege. Help us understand why some evangelicals, maybe not the ones you're working with, but some evangelicals feel that they do not have power and privilege, but that they are themselves very oppressed.
Yeah.
And help us understand why that is, and then why that might be a point of contact with other groups that are minorities and in fact don't have the same kind of power and privilege.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes Christians are persecuted in our society. Look at the University of Iowa, right? Like that case that was just the ruling that just came out yesterday. Basically, a court found that the University of Iowa was so hell-bent on kicking InterVarsity off campus that they went far beyond what the policies would have ever allowed for. And the judge says that what University of Iowa did was so egregious that they're actually making University of Iowa officials pay for InterVarsity's court costs out of their own pocket. And so that, I think, is a great example that, like, there are people in society who are hell-bent against Christian conservatism. Like, there are examples out there. And so I don't mean to say that those examples aren't out there. I just wonder if evangelicals are so drawn to this evil empire complex, whether it's vaccines or public schools or Muslims, right? There's this evil empire out there that is always trying to get us. And while we focus in on that theoretical evil empire, we're missing our neighbors, which I think is a real problem. Now, getting back to your original question, I do think that for evangelicals and Muslims, the feeling that exclusive religious claims are marginalized as society is a bridge. No doubt. I mean, some of my closest Muslim friends and I, we agree on one thing, like faith is sometimes under attack in society, and particularly faith that is strongly held and bleeds into our moral commitments, beliefs about gender, beliefs about sexual orientation, beliefs about society, about law, about all sorts of things. And I had a conversation on the phone with an imam a few months back, and he said, I'm really concerned about how sexual education is being taught in the schools to my daughter. And I said, interesting. I said, I guess I'm kind of concerned about that too, right? Like there's this feeling of concern, like is the country moving in a particular direction that might in the future marginalize committed religious faith? And it's possible. Again, I don't think it's healthy to fixate on our privileges, because again, I don't see that at all in the person of Christ. And you probably don't either. Someone who fixated on what they deserved and what their rights and privileges were. But anyway, I do think that particularly for those people who are really serious about their faith, they do have very similar concerns in our country. And particularly about religious liberty. I mean, maybe some of you have heard in the news that, for example, there's a new book that came out called Islam is Not a Religion. And basically, it's a book about how in the courts, particularly in the South for some time, there are people who are literally trying to deny Islam the status of a religion in our country so that they can't have the benefits that nonprofit religious groups get. And again, I think Christians should be able to say, well, there are also occasions where I feel like someone is trying to take away my right to, say, be on a college campus, as we saw with Intervarsity at the University of Iowa. So I think what you're saying, I think you're right, is there are areas there, I think, to work together and to say, how can we ensure that religion remains a big part of society and we can be safe expressing our religion in our society.
There's a fair amount of Christian presence here on campus, a number of Christian groups and organizations.
Yeah.
What's one practical way that they could engage in being a neighborly neighbor to their Muslim brothers and sisters?
Yeah, so I always think it starts with being generous without expecting anything in return. I really think that's the start. And if I would say, it really has to start there, because I think too often Christians go about their religious neighbors in strategic ways. I don't want to think that anyone approaches me on campus because they've got a strategy for me. That just doesn't feel like I'm being seen as human, but that I'm being seen as a number or seen as, I remember when I was in college in crew, I mean, like we would have these like an hour before crew would start, we would go out and we would all share the gospel. And there was sort of that like silent pressure, like, wait, did the person you talked to accept Christ? Like my person accepted Christ. And then like everybody would jump in front of the room at the beginning of the weekly meeting and say, the person I talked to accepted Christ. And it was kind of this like, do we even know who we're talking about? Like, we're talking about people theoretically, not as real people. And I think by beginning with sort of this selfless generosity, I mean, like I said, when we bought $750 of halal food for our neighbors for the simple purpose of saying, we love you, we see you, we care about you, and we're glad you're here, like that did not come with any strings attached. And the crazy thing is, like, people still had faith conversations that night, and I think part of those conversations were made possible by the fact that they knew, like, we care about you. Like, we see you as people, not as, some Christians will say, like, I want to reach the city. But even the city is it's a theoretical sounding word, right? We're not talking about real people. We're talking about this, like, secular world that we're out here to save. And so I think talking about people as people and saying we want to jumpstart this relationship with generosity and being good hosts. A lot of times people don't realize, like, a lot of Christians will say, like, well, I'm going to go to the mosque, And that's a great impulse, but the issue is, if there's one mosque in a city and 250 churches, that mosque is usually inundated with people on field trips, on observations. Like, everybody wants to go to the mosque. Everyone has that impulse, right? Like, we should go to the mosque. So I would really recommend that Christians on campus start by being the host. And make sure that you have, and I would speak to them and say, we want to make sure you feel safe in our space. How can we do that? Like, how can we make sure that when you walk into our space, you feel loved? And I think those conversations are key. I think communication is so key in these engagements. You'd be surprised how much can be figured out or how much can be avoided just by saying things like, I'm afraid that if you come to my Christian space, that you won't feel welcome. How do I make sure that doesn't happen? Again, just being as transparent about those concerns as much as possible and trusting that people do have the maturity to work those things out. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you
Thanks,
again
everybody.
so very much. A couple of just housekeeping things from me. Again, if you can fill out this really great green sheet, that'd be great. If you are here for Live 100-201, we have Maddie in the back corner. If you have any questions about how to use this lecture for your class, she can help you out with that. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. Have a good night.